Carrying on, Chapter 5, Ideology by Eagleton, from Adorno to Bourdieu. So in the previous video, I went through some background stuff about exchange and a few Marxian kinds of ideas that are important to the Frankfurt School. Remember, they're kind of West European cultural Marxists. I looked a little bit at where this Frankfurt School comes from. And remember, it's located in Frankfurt, obviously, but it has kind of a very interesting history, the school itself, which I touched on. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this video as well. Okay, so our first main thinker that we're going to look at, really the key thinker that I will talk about, that's from the early part of the Frankfurt School, is Theodor Adorno, and he comes up a lot. And so for him, what we talked about in the previous video, this notion of how the abstract exchange, right, where the background conditions of labor can make incommensurates. Remember the Christmas pudding and the toy example. They can make those things, playing, eating and playing, they can make that commensurate. Incommensurate things can be made commensurate through the notion of an abstract exchange, right, which is predicated on the object's history of labor. Same labor going in allows you to ignore all kinds of use value differences and concentrate on exchange value, and you get a commensurate picture. So ideological thought, Adorno says, yeah, that's a lot like that abstract exchange, because ideological thought makes incommensurate things commensurate. It does the same thing. And it's almost like it's a natural thing that's part of us to have this notion of reduction, making incommensurate things commensurable or commensurate. And so ideological thought does this. And the question is, well, okay, how does it? Because we saw, it's done through the market, through the notion of value. It's done in a variety of ways by mathematicians, and in the notion of how they work with special things like topology, right, making donuts and coffee cups. How does this work with respect to ideology? Well, it goes something like this. There's a revulsion that thought, right, that the self or thought, these are all kind of abstract terms, but think about it this way. When thought experiences an X, whatever it happens to be, that it doesn't recognize, think about it, when you see things you don't recognize, it's an unnerving type of experience, right, for all of us, right? And this is something that Adorno and lots of thinkers pick up on this. The otherness. You can find this in Sartre. You can find this in lots. This is nothing unique. You can find it in lots of other non-Marxian thinkers as well. Is that thought, you find it in Kant. Thought is always trying to bring its experiences under concepts. It's always trying to make sense of things and bringing it under a variety of concepts. Okay, so what's going on here? Same thing. But there's something even stronger. The revulsion at otherness is when thought cannot recognize it and is like appalled by it, is disgusted by it, it finds it repugnant and what. So what it does, thought then transforms X into something that it can recognize, namely something that is like itself, right? So it's like, oh, well, I understand the world through certain categories, and those categories are kind of reflections of me. So it's a sort of a projection in that sense. So the fundamental binary under all of this is kind of like me and the other, and then there's this reduction of the other to be something like me. So in other words, it's all about me, and I reduce everything to likenesses of me. Right? That's that's the key idea of ideology. Again, you can see it resembles all kinds of other things, apart for the whole and et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, it's a kind of reductionism. And so the X threatens thought system that it can, again, in scare quotes, X threatens to escape and to show thought its own boundaries, and that's fearful. And so in order to show that thought is not bounded and trapped, it will try to accommodate everything within itself, right? So that it covers all things. So there's this sort of widening, and refusing to accept any boundaries. Anytime a boundary is bumped up against like a thing that, hey, that seems to be not something within my system, I must have hit a boundary. No, I'm going to reduce it down to something I can't, and therefore the boundary disappears and all is well. My thought is still handling everything. No boundaries for me, right? And again, it's kind of like it's all about me sort of thing. Okay, so that's the everything something akin or like me. That's sort of the notion of ideological thinking, the fundamental binary that's under it as well. So the opposite of well, ideology then is something that homogenizes the world, right? And that's why ideologies can often be, oh, that's very comforting, right? Because I don't have to deal with this kind of otherness and strangeness and things that upset me because I don't understand them. No, everything is going to be clear. It's going to all be related. It's all kind of you in a way, right? And, so that's probably a good psychological point to think about, is how much, how many people, they want everything to kind of be like what they know. Right? So when they travel, when they do things, they kind of want to see. And corporations, they know that. That's why they build franchises around the world. So you can always get that same cup of coffee or that same sandwich wherever you go. You're not dealing with otherness in any way, right? Okay, or a very limited experience of it. So that's what they're picking up on. And they're getting it largely through Marx. Through this abstract exchange notion. But again, as I say, it's much broader than just Marxian thought. You find it so in lots of places. So ideology homogenizes the world. So how are you going to undo it? How are you going to dehomogenize? Well, instead of cramming everything under, you're going to start recognizing, kind of inescapable differences rather than saying, oh no, in the end, everything's kind of like me. No, there's lots of things that just fundamentally are different, and get used to it, get over this, that there's just others. And stop trying to assimilate everything to something and let others be others, right? And let other things be unknown. So an attempt to what Adorno calls a negative dialectics. But before I do that, because it's connected to art, before I talk about that, let's do a little bit more on traditional philosophy and sort of this notion of positive dialectics, which is what's going on in here. Not necessarily with the revulsion, but if you do look at the history of lots of philosophy, it is system building, right? That's what philosophers have often done. Not all. It's fallen in and out of favor, but largely when you look at the great philosophers of the past, they were essentially system builders. So let's pick out a couple of the real, the titanic figures of the past, and I'm going to grab two of them, Plato and Hegel. So for Plato, right, the dialectic was regarded as a kind of motion of the mind, right? And as you think your way through concepts, you start off with very kind of primitive concepts, and you work your way up to increasingly abstract concepts that cover more of reality. So a very concrete would be like dog, then a less concrete but wider would be animal, then a next one up would be organism, again including everything below but more abstract, but broader, more encompassing, and you keep working your way up to organism, life, entity, object, mathematical propositions, then eventually as you keep going you get up to things like existence and being, and at the top of this hierarchy is something called the good. And you can't describe it. Why? Because in order to describe it, you need something that encompasses it, that you can put it under. So when I describe dogs, I call them animals, right? So I have another concept that I can slide dog under and then explain it by, well, a dog is a particular kind of animal, blah, blah, blah. Then you say, well, what's an animal? Well, it's a particular kind of organism, blah, blah, blah. Well, if once you work your way up to being and the good, what are they examples of? Well, they're not examples. Everything's an example of them. So that's where it kind of bottoms out, and you just have this direct experience. You walk out of the cave as the philosopher and you're like struck by the light of being, right? It's something that is directly experienced. It's not something that's an articulation. So nonetheless, so that's the whole thing. You start seeing how everything all fits together, and Of course, Dante does this in the Divine Comedy, right? And he sees God at the end. He can't describe it, although he does a little bit. But you see the whole picture, right? And it's interesting to note that at that top end, it's just something you describe, you can't describe. You describe everything below it. But then also at the other end, the real bottom things, the immediate things of sense experience, those are hard to describe as well, right? Like, what's coffee taste like? It's hard to really exactly, you kind of have to experience that. So experiential things kind of hit the very bottom and the very top. They're both experiential, and then the rest is this sort of system of concepts. But in the end, it's a kind of a harmonious whole. Read Hegel. Not an easy thing to do, but again, he's very much like this, especially if you read his logic, right? Either the greater or the lesser logic. So one's a big book, and the other one's even bigger. But he's got a similar approach, right? You can start with categories of organization of the world, and eventually no matter where you start, once you start thinking your way through the categories, and he's got some fancy logical moves that you can do. But basically, once you think your way through the categories, in order to avoid contradictions and limitations, you're going to start broadening out, and eventually you're going to get up to something what Hegel calls the absolute idea. So I'm not saying these systems are the same, but it's the same kind of approach, the notion that thought can be all encompassing, right? And you can get rid of the other. So that's a positive dialectics. Everything is going back and forth and leading up. But that homogenizes the world, says Adorno, says Marx, and all that. So that's why Marx said you got to flip it all. We got to stand Hegel on his head. I think that's more of a kind of a catchphrase, but nonetheless, the idea is you want to recognize differences, and you need it through negative dialectics. Now, negative dialectics, of course, in terms of art, right, is that thought always recognizes the other. And it sort of incorporates it, but it doesn't. There's always something intrinsically elusive about the artistic object. And in this sense, the artistic object is something that celebrates, recognizes, and dehomogenizes the world. So art will give you new experiences that don't fit into your older ones, different ways of organizing your experience. So art is sort of an openness, right? Art is that by which we keep open to the otherness of things. All right, and this is going to counter. Right? So this is a negative dialectics by keeping things open and not sort of compressing them all and trying to get them all into one system. So, and it's a way of just saying, kind of, sort of casually put, it's a way of dealing with the revulsion of otherness. It's through art, right? We work things out through art. And that keeps things alive and independent. Now, also, and this is very common in people who are, kind of in that Marxian tradition and in the critical theory. Remember, critical theory with the capital C and the capital T, and in a lot of the other species of critical theory as well. There's something very interesting that they hold is and you'll see this in a variety of thinkers of this kind of tradition, is that because reason is doing this, kind of trying to homogenize things because of its revulsion, all that reason itself is something like it's reducing and consuming, right? And it sort of suggests something monstrous, right? That reason is trying to bring everything under control, bring everything within its command, explain, give the existence conditions for everything, right? It's trying to run the whole show. And in this sense, it's people say, well, reason is something that's inherently violent, right? And some of the romantics of the 19th century, they thought that, they didn't really think of it in the terms of reason pulling everything together. They thought reason, was like, as some of the romantics like to say, Coleridge and the gang, they would say, no, reason is this sort of scalpel that's cutting things apart. In order to study a flower, it chops it up. And it sort of murders things. We murder to dissect, and that's how science and reason and things it's abstracting from life and chopping things up, and giving in order to get things under its control, it's got to murder things. Think about in the olden days, and I'm unfortunately old enough to remember this, when we would study organisms, they'd be in formaldehyde, they're dead, right? That's not a lie. That's not really a living organism. That's a snapshot. That's a very abstract representation of an organism to study it, as it's dead, right? I mean, I'm sure many paleontologists would give anything to be in a room with a real dinosaur walking around and not always study sort of the remnants of it, through fossils and things like that, because they're forever. Well, maybe not forever, but they certainly seem to be doomed to always study things at their discipline very abstractly. Everything's dead and gone, right? They don't have living things there anymore. So this is there's a very negative kind of post-romantic with still the underpinnings of, reason is something inherently violent and distorting because it has to distort because it encounters things that are other. So it's got to twist them to fit into its framework. And of course, that view of reason and science, that has a long history, of back to Bacon, and Kant also talks about subjecting nature, and there's all kinds of imagery that strike us now as a bit distasteful about constraining the tiger or nature as female, and science is this constraining sort of manipulating things and whatnot, rather than being a natural kind of approach, an open-ended approach. Now it comes in and imposes itself, and it twists things out of shape in order to get it to fit, right? And you think about when scientists, do experiments, highly artificial, right? You don't bump into scientists when you're walking down the street. They're not doing their stuff. They're all buried away in labs. So, but that's a very, so kind of romantic, quasi-Marxian kind of view of reason, that it is inherently violent and manipulative. And its end game, what's its end game, is the suppression of difference, right? Is to bring everything under this giant manifold of concepts. Okay, not a very pleasant notion, but that's kind of how they see this. Eagleton is a bit, okay, let's not get too carried away. It is. It's important, he says, you got to remember these guys are probably traumatized a bit. Who wouldn't be? They experienced, the fury of the coming of the Third Reich. The third, imagine, you're in a school and the Nazis shut it down. It's going to be a deeply upsetting and unpleasant experience, and mild compared to what the other things the Nazis did, of course. But so that Eagleton suggests that there's probably a little bit of projection here. The extreme ideology of the Nazis, would no doubt have influenced these guys. And then they turned around, says Eagleton, and they probably took that extreme ideological pressure they felt from the Nazis and then turned around and then applied it generally and said, well, this is what all reason does. This is what democracies are doing and all that. And Eagleton's kind of in line with other critics who say, that's a bit heavy-handed. Like, this stuff might have some place, but, it seems a bit, of a heavy-handed criticism of liberal democracies. And it's too, it's awfully crude. It's kind of Procrustean to force liberal democracies into this kind of notion of a positive dialectics and the suppression of all difference. Even though liberal democracies, of course, have, as we've seen, Eagleton has lots of things to say, lots of very negative type criticisms of them. But they're for that they're not really just suppressing all difference and crushing everything in their path in order to get one kind of system that governs everything. How because they do make room for some difference, quite a bit of difference, maybe not as much as some people would like, and fine, but they also have a track record of differences. More differences come in and become accepted. It's and they're not perfectly. It's not just this great linear street that just keeps going up. It's bumpy and all that. Sometimes there's rollbacks and things like that, but it doesn't seem to quite fit this model, that it's a crushing of all difference out of existence. So and also I think Eagleton makes a nice point, even if they are guilty of kinds of things, sort of forcing them into this Procrustean bread, it doesn't do any good politically, right? He thinks, and I'm sympathetic to this line, that there's nothing to be politically gained by caricaturing one's opponent. All right, so again, there's much more going on in the chapter about Adorno. I'm going to leave it at that. And the key thing is sort of this Marxian background that leads into this abstract notion of exchange, which leads into this fundamental notion of otherness, revulsion, and that leads into his discussion of ideology as some kind of reductive measure that consciousness does, and that one way to bring back the other, to prevent it from this positive dialectics, from suppressing all differences, of course, not surprisingly, and again reminds you of the Romantics, is the salvation is in art, and that will help keep, shall we say, the otherness alive and something to be celebrated rather than feared and experienced with a sense of revulsion. Okay, so that's it for that. For Adorno, next video, I'll turn to Habermas. See you then.